Oh, yeah.
Oh, sorry. Oh, yes. Okay, thank you. Welcome back, and thank you once again to Andy for that fascinating talk. And it really has set the scene for where we're going to go now, which is down to our own graveyard. We've got 6 Commonwealth war graves in St Mary's Cemetery. Each of them has a story to tell, from the youngest, who was a lad of 19, to the oldest, who was a married man with 2 children. They all have to be called to service. They all have their story to tell. I'll try and bring out that story over the next few minutes. Before I do that, just to explain how we got here, I joined the RAF in the mid-70s, and like everybody who joins a service, your early education is about what your service has achieved. And I hate to use the word ethos, but you know what I mean, the military ethos. So I learned about the history of the Royal Air Force, which in those days was less than 60 years old. So our competitor military services said that we didn't have any history, we just had habits. But those habits, for me anyway, those habits included the Battle of Britain, where we learned about the exploits and the achievements of the Battle of Britain pilots, and they were heroes. And that was what we were taught, and I'm sure the Army were taught of their own heroes, and the Navy had many, many more. But we learned over time that it wasn't necessarily the famous people who were the heroes. Those are the public figures, the well-known figures, but there were lots of other people who were not known. They were in the Air Force, they were the ground crew, they were the engineers, they were probably the pioneer corps, people who they just were not in the public eye. And even later on in your career, you learned about the achievements and the heroism of the other services, and you subsequently learned actually that in death, as Andy has said, in death there's no hierarchy. That what we were there to do was to learn about and honour our predecessors, because they were the backbone and the history of what we were there to do. So when I saw the sign outside the church, we moved to Old Basin Catholic site. It obviously piqued my interest, because I'd known about Tyne-Cot, I'd known about the huge cemeteries overseas, and I knew there was some in this country, but I didn't realise there were any in our own churchyard. So, next slide, please. I was initially drawn to the RAF personnel in there, but then I wanted to learn more about the others. So this is the churchyard on Church Lane. Somebody left me where it was, so that's what it looks like in the summertime. Those are just some of the memorials. So you can see 1, 2, and 3. They're the Portland stone headstones, which Andy has described with the inscription. But you can see that they're not in serried ranks, they're scattered throughout the churchyard. And so this sort of piqued my interest, and I wondered why they were there, and why they were not in neat rows like I was expecting. Well, as we've learned, they were there because they did not die in battle, they did not die in the siege, but they died serving their own country in this country. And why are they not in serried ranks? Because actually they were buried when they died, which was not all at the same time. And again, it struck me as odd, when you think about the Second World War, you probably don't think of anything but the fighting. But other things went on throughout normal daily life. So people were buried, people were married, people were in prison. That went on. So within the mayhem of war, people were still buried and recognised in our own church. So what do we know about our boys? And they are boys, as Andy said, men and women throughout the war, but ours are all boys. I just wanted to give you a quick thumbnail of all 6. I wasn't sure how to do it. In military fashion, it should be alphabetical probably, or maybe according to age, but I've done it chronologically in the order in which they died. So the next one, please, Andy. This is Corporal William Inkhead. William Penn's a famous name locally, and people may well know the Penn family. But William Penn, he was the son of William and Annie Penn of Old Basil. He was one of 5 children, and he was born on the 30th of March in 1920, and he was baptised here in St Mary's in June of that year. And at that time, the family were living in Bartlett's Lane. In 1941, Corporal William Penn was serving as ground crew on number 83 Squadron, which was at RAF Scampton. Now Scampton was the base for which 617 Squadron was to launch its raid on the Downs later on in the war. But in 1941, the 25th of August 1941, an accident occurred when a Handley Page bomber returned from a raid in Germany and taxed into the dispersal area, at which point an unused bomb fell out of the bomb bay and exploded. All the airmen on the aircraft were killed, and the 4 ground crew, including Corporal William Penn. He was 21 years old at the time. The next one is Corporal Albert Charles Hine. His memorial, his gravestone is slightly separate from the others, against a rather grown edge. Now, Albert Hine was born in Old Basil on the 4th of October 1918. He was one of 9 children. His parents, William George and Mabel Hine, and he was baptised here at St Mary's on the 15th of December in 1918. And in the 1939 census, his family was registered as living in Piatt's Hill. At the time of his death, Corporal Hine was 23 years old, and he was serving on the first wing of the Glider Pilot Regiment of the Army Air Corps. The glider pilots were a special breed. They tended to go on one-way trips. They were pilots when they flew out, they landed the gliders, and then they became fighting soldiers. So at the time, on the 10th of August 1942, he was undergoing training at number 2 Glider Training School at RAF Weston-on-the-Green, which is about 60 miles north of here, just north of Oxford. He was killed when the Hotspur glider that he was in, which was stationary on the runway, was struck by a Miles Master towing another glider, which was taking off. It always strikes me as, I mean, any loss of life is a waste. But when you're training for something as important as that, to be killed in a training accident, it just seems to be a complete and utter waste. But regardless of whether he was in action or not, he was doing the job for which he was trained to do the job for which he'd volunteered. Excuse me. And moving on to Arthur Ridge, the third of our boys. Now, Geoffrey Arthur Ridge was born on the 1st of November 1894 in Fremington, which is near Barnstaple in Devon. He was the first child of Frank and Emily Ridge, and he and his siblings, he had 3 siblings, another Frank Jr., Florence and James, and they all grew up in Devon. So on the 3rd of September 1914, at the age of 19, Geoffrey was called up to fight in the First World War. And presumably because he had completed 4 years of a 5-year apprenticeship, he enlisted in the Royal Engineers at Exeter. However, 2 years later, in June 1916, he remustered to the Royal Navy, where he signed on for a 12-year engagement. After the First World War, in 1919, he married Gladys Bartlett, who was from Newton Abbot, so still in Devon at the time. But by 1939, Gladys is recorded living with her 2 sons, Geoffrey Jr. and Michael, at 68 Hatch Lane, Old Basil. Her occupation is listed as unpaid domestic duties, and her husband Geoffrey, at the time, is not listed as being with the family. This was the 1939 census. So although his 12-year engagement with the Navy would have ended in 1928, we can assume that at the outbreak of the Second World War, he was called up and was back in the Royal Navy, where he served as an engine room artificer first class. He died on 18th of November 1944 at the Mount Sanatorium, which is in Bishopsgate, at the age of 50. The actual cause of death is not known, but at the time, the Mount Sanatorium treated patients who were suffering from tuberculosis, so we can make an assumption that he suffered from that. As you can see, there's much about Geoffrey Ridge that we do not know, but what we can say is that he lived in very turbulent times. And during his lifetime, he spent a total of 9 years of his life fighting to defend his country. There's a small break in the dates now, and I was going to explain why there's a break in the dates, but Andy has done much better than I do. Because the dates on the next memorials are December 45, October 46, and February 47. Initially, I thought after the end of the Second World War, so why they're there. But now we know, because administratively, the Second World War went on until the end of 1947. So that leads us to Private Raymond George Blake, who died in December 1945. Now, Raymond Blake was born here in the Basingstoke Administration District. He was born in 1926. His parents were Noah and Olive, and they were married a year previously, also in Basingstoke, and he was the only son of 3 children. Noah, Raymond's father, had been baptised here in St Mary's in 1904. As you can see from the headstone there, Raymond was a private in the Royal Army Ordnance Corps, and he died on the 3rd of December 1945, aged only 19. Now, a report in the Hants and Berks Gazette, which at the time was Basingstoke's local paper, it stated that on the 3rd of December, at Ashby Gullyzouge in Leicestershire, whilst driving an army lorry which was towing another army lorry, he had to apply the brakes, which caused the tow vehicle to collide with one he was driving. The tow bar broke, and his vehicle went through a hedge and overturned, and Raymond received a fractured skull, which killed him instantly. At the time of his death, Raymond's grandparents, Mr. and Mrs. Henry Thomas, they were stated as his guardians, and they were living in the street in Old Bailey. And it's a tragic coincidence that Raymond's father had been killed exactly 15 years previously, on the exact same day. He was also a serviceman, and he met his death whilst riding a motorcycle. The fifth of our boys is Frederick Gunner. Leading aircraft Frederick Gunner. He was born in Basingstoke in 1922. His mother, Minnie Goff, was from Old Basing, but she had married his father, William, in Grantham in 1916. So Frederick and the family, they grew up away from Old Basing. They moved from Lincolnshire through Nottinghamshire, but by 1939 they were living in 2 Silvers Road, just down the road. By this time, Frederick's father had died, and his mother was working as an unpaid domestic help. Frederick had an older brother, William, who was a labourer, and 2 older sisters, Ada and Winifred, and Winifred was a daily girl. Frederick served in the Royal Air Force Volunteer Reserve as a leading aircraftsman, and he was still in the RFVR when he died in the Mount Sanatorium at Bishopsgate on the 11th of October 1946, at the age of 23. So again, the Mount Sanatorium in their demise. And the final headstone belongs to leading aircraftsman Michael Crotty. There's very little in the official records about L.A.C. Crotty. The CWG website has got some basic details, which I can give you now, but a small team of us was doing some research online, and we could find out very little about that. What we do know, he was born in Ballinaclone in Waterford, Ireland, on the 31st of March 1913. He was the son of Dennis and Bridget Crotty, and he was one of 14 children. Now, Michael married Lily Eiley Lily Albright here in the Basingstoke Registration District in 1939. Now, Lily was from here. She'd been baptised at St Mary's on the 2nd of January 1916. And Lily and Michael went on to have 3 daughters, all registered in the local area. Now, the connection with Old Basing seems to have come from the fact that Lily's father and mother, Thomas and Sarah, along with her siblings, were living in 2 Barton's Lane in 1939. Now, we know that Leslie Cottier served in the Royal Air Force Volunteer Reserve, and we know that he died on the 3rd of February 1947, aged 33. But that is all we're going to find out about. So, if anybody here knows anything about LAC Cottier, then please let us know. Originally, this annoyed me because, from a sense of completeness, there was one person who didn't know how he died, and I'm a bit sort of OCD. But then I thought about it, and I guess it's what Andrew was saying before. It doesn't, although it's interesting to find out why these people died, in the end, it's not how they died, it's why. And whatever the details of their service records, or how they died, these were all men with families, with friends, with people who loved them. Some were just out of school, others had wives and families, but all of them gave up their homes and their families, and they set aside their way of life here in Old Basing and answered the call to defend their country and their way of life. And that is why we should remember them. So those are our 6 war graves. Those are our boys in the Old Basing Cemetery here. I'd just like to leave you with this thought, that the Second World War took the lives of more than 20 million military personnel of all nations. I can't imagine 20 million people. It's just beyond my comprehension. I can't even imagine what 2 million people are. But I can call to mind 6 people. And next Sunday, during the 2-minute silence, I will be thinking of the 6 men who answered the call to defend their country against something evil, and who gave up their lives protecting a way of life that they believed in. Thank you very much. Rick now is going to tell us about something going to on the wall just outside the church.
Microphone says it's on, so I guess it is. Evening, everyone. First of all, thank you very much to Andy and Mike for their really informative talks, and thank you very much to all of you for turning out in the dark and pretty damp night as well. There's some interesting insights there into the magnificent work that the CWG do. In regard to our own headstones that were only quite recently installed, it's something I think we should all be quite proud of. I'm sure that many of you who have travelled through France and Belgium and seen the countless small cemeteries as described earlier by Abby, you may even have visited, whether you have a relative there or whether you're just interested in that kind of thing. I'm sure you would be moved at the enormity of just how many of these brave souls paid the ultimate price, some as young as just 16 years of age. I've had the honour of visiting many of these during my time as Assistant Bandmaster in the Royal British Legion, Corps of Drums, and also as an Army Cadet instructor before that. We performed abroad with a band in lots of ceremonial services, and my wife Penny and I also took a 5-day tour with Major Holidays a couple of years back to visit some various World War I cemeteries. Whilst none of my immediate family perished in either conflict, I did lose some distant relatives on my maternal side during World War I and II, and I would very much like to just pay my respects to them one day on the sites of their burial. One was a great uncle, Company Sergeant Major Walter Rainbird of the 1st and 4th Battalion Hampshire Regiment, who was taken prisoner during fighting in the Middle East and died in prison in Iraq. He's buried in Baghdad, Northgate River Cemetery, so I feel it's kind of unlikely that I might go visit him there. Private Paul Rainbow, the second great uncle of the 2nd Battalion Hampshire Regiment, he died at Flanders during 1916, and he's buried in Pollitt's Chateau Wood Cemetery, which is quite close to Ypres, and only a few miles from cemeteries I've actually been to, so I felt quite guilty when I read this afterwards, that I really, just a step across, I could have visited. A further second great uncle, Private Robert Rainbow, who also served in the Hampshire Regiment, died in 1942. He's buried in Majed's Alabama War Cemetery in Tunisia. Both grandfathers, Richard Rainbow, Devon of Dorset, and Albert Bourne, the Royal Field Artillery, both fought in both wars and lived through, fortunately for me. It was the medals that Albert was awarded during his time in the Royal Field Artillery I proudly wear each Remembrance Day. There's a photograph of them here, you can see this is our own. So moving on to that, for 7 years I had the honour of representing the Old Bays and Royal British Legion branches as chairman. So it was my duty to read out the names of the 44 fallen on our own memorial each year. Yes, we've heard only 6 of these men are actually buried here in St Mary's Cemetery. This was because, as Michael had said, they had died after hostilities, either from wounds sustained or from illness contracted during that time. In early 2014, and as a tribute to the centenary of the outbreak of World War I, the Royal British Legion decided to investigate and to record as much information as it could about the names of these men on the war memorial. Followed an immeasurable amount of work of research effort by Mr. Brian Dawes and other members of Old Bays Branch to produce the contents of this book, and it's the contents of which can also be found online by scanning the QR code that appears in the foyer notice board and outside next to the memorial. Scanning this will take you to everything that we discovered about each person, which then led us to ask the question, who were these souls? Where did they live? What lives did they have? Were they local, or did they just join up here? But most importantly, do they still have relatives who live here? At the time of the project, we put out a call to the parish asking this question, but alas, there was no response. Some names, I'm sure, are indeed familiar to many of you, and you'd hope that living relatives today might have surfaced. But on further investigation, I recently found out, for example, that Charles Hine is not actually related to the several Hines that have been living in Basing over the last few decades, or at least that's what I found out. I don't believe that William Ingpen has any family now, although I understand that he was the brother of the locally very well-known Betty Holmes, Betty Bennington. I think Michael quoted that he had 9 brothers and sisters, one of them was Betty, and I know a lot of you of perhaps more advancing years knew her. But of course, William is fortunately commemorated by actually a road name in Lichfield, one of Ingpen Gardens. I personally knew a few members of the Tickwell family who worked at Thornycross in the 1970s. Perhaps they were relatives of William or George Tickwell, but we both sadly perished in the war. But as I began to give him hope, right here, in this church, was our own Jeanette Edwards, who said, I hope you're going to mention my great Uncle Albert, Uncle Albert Illsley. So there's Albert, that's his name on the memorial outside. Jeanette furnished me with a huge amount of detail, clearly lovingly collated through years of research, but sadly too much to show all of it here. However, I'd like to share some of it so that we can visualise Albert's life before and during the Great War. Though born in Odium in 1892, Albert moved to Old Bays, living in Crown Lane with his parents, Michael and Charlotte. It was then recorded that he lived with his grandparents in Dunham, and at the age of 9 was working alongside them as a farm labourer. His detailed war records were lost in the bombing of London in World War II, but he either joined or was conscripted in Old Bailey when he was old enough, as did many men who worked on the land in those days. He was sent to France with the 7th Battalion, the Duke of Cornwall's Light Infantry Regiment. And at the age of just 26, he was killed in action in the Battle of St. Quentin on the 23rd of March 1918. Early in what was a prolonged and bitter battle known to the Germans as Operation Michael. And he is buried in Chauny Communal Cemetery, British extension near Ain in France. It's recorded that the area around Chauny was of strategic importance due to its great key transportation routes and its canal, and the Germans were determined to win this battle. The Duke of Cornwall's Light Infantry, along with other Allied units, were tasked with holding the line. During the whole of March 1918, the British forces took a terrible pounding from elite stormtroopers and overwhelming odds. Whilst there were heavy casualties during this period, ultimately the courage of men like Elbert proved decisive, and as we know, the war ended some 8 months later. Next slide, please. So these are pictures of the cemetery, one that Anthony, where Albert died. Just last month, Jeanette's brother, Anthony Vickers, himself an ex-serviceman, visited the grave, and there is a photograph of that cemetery here, which you can see is pretty extensive. After some time spent searching, Anthony was pleased that he found Albert's headstone and proud of what his relative had fought for. However, it must have been quite upsetting to learn that Albert's surname had been incorrectly spelled on the headstone, and that his remains were not actually in that actual spot, but had been placed in a mass grave close by. We have to take into account that given the task of burying all these men and marking their resting places accurately would have been a massively complex operation and could never have been expected to be 100% accurate. Just before I started, I actually managed to have a chat with Andy about this fact, about the misspelling. And it's the name that he would have served under. So we can only assume that perhaps when he signed up, the person that listened to what his name was when they wrote it on the roster was actually, he got that wrong, he spelt it wrong. There could have been some literacy problems, and Albert actually didn't know that his name was Crucially and not Italy. There's a number of reasons, because I know when Jeanette showed me the picture of the grave itself and the misspelling, his records that we do know of so far, still existed, did actually have his name there. So that unfortunately, for the relatives today, is what they've done with Espen. I think that's pretty much right, isn't it? Yeah. But nevertheless, being in the area where a loved one perished must have been quite consoling, and would have been, where he would have been less rest, must have brought an enormous comfort and pride to his surviving family, even these years on. So, in closing, a bit like Michael said, can I suggest that when we attend this year's remembrance service, that you will listen to the memorial names being read out. Consider focusing on one. Try to imagine the brief life that person had before his life came to an early end and so wasted. Imagine the pain that loved ones back in England would have felt receiving such dreadful news, and how they might feel every year at this time. But I believe that this is why we should continue to always find time to remember what was given by so many years ago, that we can enjoy the life we lead, a bit like Michael Allen. Thanks very much indeed. That brings the evening to a close. Again, just like to thank you all for coming. I think you could probably continue to have some refreshments if you'd like to stay. What I would really like to encourage you to do is to place a donation, either a cash one in the jar or by scanning the code that's over there. Any proceeds will be shared between the church and the Royal British Legion Poppy Bill. If you haven't got a poppy, some over there as well, you can have yourself. So there's always a commercial end, there's always a student in town. Come for a nice free evening. Really appreciate you coming this evening and thank you for so much.